On the morning of May 10th, 1940, as German bombs rained down on London and Neville Chamberlain's government collapsed like a house built on sand, a 19-year-old woman named Mavis Lever stood in the drawing room of her parents' home in Dulwich, staring at an envelope that would change the course of her life and the fate of millions. The envelope was cream-colored, unremarkable, bearing only her name in typed letters. Inside, a single sentence requested her presence at a location she had never heard of, a place that did not officially exist, for work that could not be described. She had applied for a position weeks earlier after her German professor at University College London had whispered about interesting opportunities for clever girls who could keep secrets. Now, with France teetering on the edge of collapse and Britain standing alone against the Nazi war machine, that whisper had materialized into something real and terrifying. Mavis folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Through the window, she could see her mother tending the Victory Garden, methodically turning soil that might soon be the only thing standing between her family and starvation. Her father had already left for his work at the Ministry of Supply, his face drawn with the exhaustion of a man watching civilization crumble. They had not asked what the letter contained. In wartime Britain, there were questions one simply did not ask. 3 days later, Mavis found herself on a train heading north from London, surrounded by soldiers in khaki uniforms who laughed too loudly and smoked too much, their eyes betraying the fear they tried to mask with bravado. The countryside rolled past in shades of green that seemed almost obscene in their normalcy, as if the fields and hedgerows had not received the message that the world was ending. She clutched her handbag tightly, feeling the weight of the return ticket inside, wondering if she would ever use it. The station at Bletchley was smaller than she had expected, a modest Victorian building that serviced a modest Victorian town. A woman in civilian clothes waited on the platform, holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who had performed this particular duty too many times to find it interesting anymore. She checked Mavis's papers with mechanical efficiency, then gestured toward a waiting car without bothering with pleasantries. The drive to the estate took less than 10 minutes. They passed through gates guarded by men with rifles, down a tree-lined drive that opened suddenly onto a vista that defied all logic and expectation. Bletchley Park sprawled before her like a fever dream conjured by an architect who could not decide between Victorian Gothic and utilitarian nightmare. The main mansion rose in red brick splendor, its turrets and gables suggesting garden parties and weekend shoots, while around it clustered a growing collection of wooden huts that spoke instead of desperate improvisation and bureaucratic chaos. The woman with the clipboard deposited Mavis at the entrance to Hut 6, offered a brisk nod, and departed without explanation. For several long minutes, Mavis stood alone, clutching her handbag and feeling utterly ridiculous. Around her, men and women hurried past with armfuls of papers, their faces set in expressions of intense concentration. No one looked at her. No one asked if she needed help. It was as if she had become invisible the moment she stepped onto the grounds. "You must be the new girl." The voice came from behind her, crisp and aristocratic with an undertone of amusement. Mavis turned to find a tall woman in her 30s, dark hair pulled back severely, eyes that seemed to catalogue and dismiss in a single glance. "I'm Margaret Rock. I run the Italian section." "You've studied German, I understand, but we need you for Italian naval codes. Can you learn quickly?" Mavis nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Follow me. We haven't much time, and I haven't much patience for hand-holding. The Mediterranean is about to become a killing field, and we're the only ones who can prevent it." Inside Hut 6, the air smelled of cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and something else Mavis could not immediately identify as sharp, acrid scent she would later recognize as the smell of minds burning themselves out in service of an impossible task. The main room was crammed with tables covered in papers, mechanical devices she did not recognize, and ashtrays overflowing with the detritus of desperate concentration. Along one wall, a bank of filing cabinets stood like silent sentinels, each drawer labeled with mysterious combinations of letters and numbers. Margaret Rock led her to a corner table where a young man with wire-rimmed spectacles was hunched over what appeared to be a grid of letters, muttering to himself. He looked up as they approached, blinked as if surprised to find himself in the presence of other humans, then returned immediately to his work. "That's Alfred," Margaret said. "He doesn't talk much." "None of us do, really. You'll understand why soon enough." She cleared a space on the table and produced a folder thick with documents. This is the Italian naval Enigma. Not the same as the German military Enigma the other sections are working on. Different settings, different procedures, different psychology. The Italians are methodical, where the Germans are rigid, creative, where the Germans are mechanical. That makes them both easier and harder to break, depending on the day and the operator and whether Mercury is in retrograde. Mavis must have looked confused because Margaret smiled, though the expression did not reach her eyes. That's a joke, mostly. You'll learn that humor is the only thing that keeps us sane here, along with exhaustion so complete that you forget to feel the weight of what we're doing. Over the next hours, Margaret walked Mavis through the fundamentals of cryptanalysis with the brisk efficiency of someone describing how to boil an egg. The Enigma machine, she explained, was a German invention sold commercially before the war, then modified by various military branches into supposedly unbreakable cipher devices. Each machine had 3 or more rotors that scrambled letters through a complex series of electrical pathways, with billions of possible settings. Breaking the code required finding which settings were used for a particular message, a task that should have been mathematically impossible. Should have been, Margaret repeated, tapping the folder for emphasis. But the Germans and Italians made mistakes. They got lazy. They used predictable message formats. They sent weather reports at the same time every day. They signed off with the same phrases. They were human, and humans are creatures of habit, even when habit might get them killed. She pulled out a sheet covered in 5-letter groups. This was intercepted yesterday from an Italian naval station in Libya. We know it's naval because of the frequency and the call signs. We know it's urgent because they send it 3 times. We know it's important because they use the officer-grade cipher rather than the standard military one. What we don't know is what it says, and somewhere in the Mediterranean, there are British ships sailing into waters where Italian submarines might be waiting. Those ships are filled with men who have families and futures and dreams of surviving this bloody war. Those men are going to die unless we can read this message and warn them in time. Mavis looked at the incomprehensible string of letters and felt a weight settle onto her shoulders that she would carry for the rest of her life. This was not an academic exercise. This was not a puzzle to be solved for the intellectual satisfaction of solving it. Every letter on that page represented the difference between life and death, between ships making port safely and ships sinking beneath the waves with all hands lost. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "None of us knew if we could do it. None of us know if we can keep doing it. But we don't have the luxury of doubt. The Germans are marching across Europe. The Italians control the Mediterranean. Japan is looking hungrily at British possessions in Asia. We're losing, Mavis. Badly. This place, these huts, these impossible puzzles. This is the only advantage we have. This is the only reason Britain is still in the war. So yes, you can do this because the alternative is unthinkable." She left Mavis alone with the folder, the incomprehensible message, and the crushing weight of responsibility. For a long time, Mavis simply stared at the letters, trying to see patterns that refused to emerge. Around her, the work of Hut 6 continued with quiet intensity. Somewhere a typewriter clattered. Someone coughed. The man named Alfred continued his muttering, occasionally scratching notes onto a pad with fierce concentration. Mavis pulled out the chair and sat down. She opened the folder and began to read through the supporting materials frequency analysis charts, suspected message formats, examples of previously broken codes. The light outside the windows faded from afternoon gold to evening gray. Someone brought her a cup of tea that she drank without tasting. The letters on the page began to swim before her tired eyes, but she forced herself to focus, to look for the patterns Margaret had described, the human errors that made the impossible merely extraordinarily difficult. It was past midnight when she noticed something odd about the message. The same 5-letter group appeared 3 times, always at the beginning of a new section. In proper Italian, many words ended with vowels. If this was a standardized message format, if the operators were following a protocol, then perhaps that repeated group was a delimiter, a mechanical artifact rather than actual content. Her heart began to beat faster. She pulled out another intercepted message from earlier in the week, one that had been partially broken by analysts working on different material. Yes, there was the same 5-letter group used in exactly the same way. She grabbed a 3rd message, then a 4th, her hands shaking as the pattern became clear. "Margaret!" she called out, her voice cracking with exhaustion and excitement. "Margaret, I think I found something." Margaret appeared from the shadows where she had been working at another table. moving with the quick grace of someone who had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and nervous energy. She leaned over Mavis's shoulder, scanning the papers spread across the table, and for a long moment said nothing. "This is good work," she said finally. "This is very good work for your first day. But finding a pattern is only the beginning. Now comes the hard part, using this to break into the actual cipher settings, to understand how they've configured their rotors and plug boards and ring positions. That could take days or weeks, and we might not have that much time." She glanced at the clock on the wall, which showed midnight. "Go home, get some sleep. Come back tomorrow ready to think in ways you've never thought before. And Mavis?" She waited until Mavis looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Don't tell anyone what you're doing here. Not your parents, not your friends, not the nice boy who asks you to dance at the village social. The Official Secrets Act isn't a suggestion. People who talk about this work disappear into prison cells and never come out. Do you understand?" Mavis nodded, feeling the last of her innocence slip away like water through cupped hands. The car that took her back to her lodgings in town drove through blackout darkness, the headlamps hooded to prevent German bombers from using their light for navigation. Somewhere overhead, she could hear the distant drone of aircraft engines, whether British or German she could not tell. In London, people were sheltering in underground stations, praying that the bombs would fall somewhere else. In France, the Wehrmacht was consolidating its occupation. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were sending British merchant ships to the bottom at a rate that would starve Britain into submission within months if something did not change. And in a wooden hut in a nowhere town in the English countryside, a 19-year-old girl had just taken her first steps toward changing the course of history, though she did not know it yet. Mavis lay in her narrow bed in the boarding house, listening to the sounds of other residents preparing for sleep, and wondered what she had gotten herself into. The incomprehensible letter groups danced behind her closed eyelids. She thought about the ships Margaret had mentioned, the men who would die if she failed, the families who would receive telegrams informing them of losses at sea. The responsibility was suffocating. But beneath the fear and doubt, something else was stirring, a fierce intellectual excitement she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, her mind was not being wasted on trivial academic exercises or social niceties. For the first time, her ability to see patterns and solve puzzles mattered in a way that transcended personal achievement. She was part of something larger than herself, something that might actually matter. Sleep, when it finally came, was troubled with dreams of drowning men and indecipherable codes. She woke before dawn with a sudden insight about the message structure, so clear and urgent that she dressed without washing and hurried through the dark streets back to Bletchley Park, past guards who were becoming accustomed to seeing haunted young women arriving at ungodly hours. In Hut 6, the work never stopped. The day shift was already in place, bent over their tables and machines with the same intense concentration she had witnessed the previous day. Margaret looked up as Mavis entered, raising an eyebrow at her early arrival. "Couldn't sleep?" "I had an idea about the rotor positions," Mavis said, pulling off her coat and moving to her table. "If the Italians are following German protocols for officer-grade messages, they should be using a monthly key sheet, but what if they're actually rotating keys more frequently? What if the pattern we're seeing represents not just message structure, but a faster rotation schedule?" Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest. "Show me." For the next 3 hours they worked side by side, testing Mavis's theory against captured messages from the past 2 weeks. Slowly, painfully, a pattern emerged that was both more complex and more exploitable than they had initially believed. The Italians were indeed rotating their key settings more frequently than the Germans, but they were doing so in a pattern that followed the Italian calendar of naval operations changes aligned with ship movements and operational schedules. "If we're right about this," Margaret said slowly, spreading the analyzed messages across the table like tarot cards revealing a terrible future, "then we can predict when they'll change settings. We can prepare our attacks on new configurations in advance. We can break their communications almost in real time. And if we're wrong?" Mavis asked. Margaret's expression was grim. "Then ships sink. Men drown. We lose the Mediterranean and possibly the war." The tension in the room had become almost unbearable when the door burst open and a young man in Royal Navy uniform rushed in, his face flushed with urgency. "We've intercepted a priority message from the Italian High Command to their fleet in Taranto. It's marked urgent, repeated transmission, officer-grade cipher. We need a break on this one immediately. There's intelligence suggesting a major Italian naval operation is about to begin, and we have ships in the area that could be. He stopped, seeming to realize he was saying too much in front of someone new. His eyes found Mavis, questioning. She's cleared, Margaret said sharply. Give me the message. He handed over a sheaf of papers, still warm from the intercept station, covered in 5-letter groups that meant nothing and everything. Margaret scanned them quickly, her face going pale. This is big, she said quietly. This is very, very big. If this is what I think it is, the Italian fleet is about to make a major move in the central Mediterranean, and we have convoys heading directly into their path. She looked up at Mavis, and in her eyes was a weight of responsibility that made the previous day's burden seem light by comparison. Everything we just theorized? We need to prove it now, not tomorrow. Not next week. No, because in approximately 6 hours, British ships are going to sail into what might be a trap, and unless we can read this message and warn them, those ships and everyone on them are going to die. Mavis felt her hands begin to shake. This was it, the moment when theory became practice, when intellectual exercise became life and death. Around them, the entire section had gone quiet, everyone aware that something critical was happening, that the next few hours might determine not just individual fates, but the strategic balance of an entire theater of war. Margaret laid the message out on the table between them. Let's begin. And as the clock ticked toward dawn, as ships steamed toward unknown danger, as families slept peacefully unaware that their loved ones hung in the balance, a 19-year-old girl bent over a sheet of incomprehensible letters and began the work that would save thousands of lives and change the course of the Second World War, though the world would not know her name for another 50 years. The Mediterranean sun was rising over waters that concealed submarines and mines and the instruments of industrial death, and somewhere in those waters, British sailors were sailing toward a fate that rested in the hands of a girl who had discovered, in the space of a single day, that she possessed a talent for listening to ghosts, the ghost voices of enemy communications, whispering their secrets to anyone clever enough and desperate enough to hear them.